Okay. Well, we'll start now. I just started the recording. So this, I believe, is the 7th of our political science Saturday guest lectures. And today we have Bridget Burns, who's a Marist alum, another Marist alum coming on. She graduated in 2007, and she's going to give you her trajectory in Marist and outside of Marist, and then discuss with you what the exciting things that she's doing as the co-executive director of the Women's Environment and Development Organization, WEDO. Okay, so Bridget.
Thank you so much, and good afternoon, everyone. I know that this was probably your first choice for a beautiful Saturday afternoon to be hanging out with me, and I'm really grateful for that. It would have been mine as well back in my days. And before we get started, I was hoping that for those of you who at least are on a computer, I'm not sure how it will work for those of you who are on a phone, but I love to get to know the people that I'm spending a little bit of time with before we start talking. So I have a little Mentee Meter that I want to share with you to see how you're all feeling coming into this conversation and what your hopes and aspirations are as you do your work at Marist. And before I share that with you, as Dr. Jan said, my name's Bridget Burns. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm based out of Brooklyn, New York, which is where my home. I'm from the Bronx originally. And WEDO, my organization, the Women's Environment and Development Organization, is currently based out of Brooklyn. Although, as you can see, this is my closet that I've turned into an office and has been my office for the last few months. And I'm actually the sole director of WEDO now. I was co-director for 2 years, and now I'm the director of the organization. So I'm going to pull in the chat window a link, and some of you may have used Mentee Meter before, which basically allows you to kind of anonymously answer certain questions, and then they'll populate up on the screen. And I'm also going to share my screen with you. So the first question that I have, which we try to, at least at WEDO, remember that there is a pandemic and that there are a lot of challenging things happening at the moment in the world, and to understand how people are feeling, and I'd love to hear what's giving you hope these days. So you can enter in a word, a sentence, a person, anything you'd like, and you can do more than one. Absolutely. Amazing. A vaccine is hopefully coming soon is also what's giving me hope as well. Music, totally, me too.
You can almost see your harp there, Bridget. You can see the top of it.
Yeah, that's also part of my identity as being a harpist. Love it. Family, friends, working towards a vaccine, meditation and love, totally with you on that. Awesome. Thank you for engaging with that question. I really resonate with so many of these pieces. You know, it's really good that we have this opportunity to bring our whole selves into these conversations. I think that's one of the opportunities that we've gotten in this moment, where we can kind of take our hats off as individuals who aren't really getting by through music, meditation, love, and family. So thank you for that. The second question is something just for me to ground myself in this conversation that we're having at the moment. And you'll see from my presentation that I won't hold anybody to what kind of work they're hoping to do right now. But as you're thinking about, you know, where you might go after college and what you're filling yourself with in terms of while you're at college at Marist, in terms of the classes you're taking, what kind of work right now are you hoping to do post-Marist? And you have to click next question, I think, on the Mentee Meter if it's not clear. Awesome. international lawyers, environmental activists, awesome. Military, that's amazing. Working with nonprofits. Someone who wants to write. Great, I love this. I wanted to be most of these things as well, so great. Okay, well, I'm gonna stop this share. Thank you again for participating in that and giving me some idea of where you're coming from. As I'm trying we use Mentee Meters a lot at my organization to engage with people, but something new that I'm trying for the first time today, so hopefully it will work, is using Prezi to make sure I can continue in conversation with you, but also to be able to present. So can everybody see that? Jam, you can see my presentation? Okay, cool. All right, so I'm gonna actually time myself because I really wanna make sure as I speak, I leave some time, well, I leave a lot of time for just asking questions and having a dialogue with you, because I think that's actually the more important thing here. And so I've tried to frame a little bit of my path and then speak to what kind of were some sort of the cornerstone moments for me at Marist that led to the path I'm on right now and the position that I'm in, and then share a little bit with you about We Do, my organization, and the work we do as a global advocacy organization, what our day-to-day and my day-to-day in particular looks like. And I have, especially in the work part of this presentation, I'm going to really give you snapshots of some key pieces of work that each one I have in the past given an hour lecture on or so. So any of them that sparks your interest, I'd be happy to dive deeper into when we get into the question piece. And if things pop up as I'm speaking that you want more information on, please use the chat to let me know, and I will either keep it in my mind or come back to it, or just answer it as it's going. So, you know, Jam talked about thinking through this from my trajectory, and I don't want to bore you with necessarily an autobiography of myself. Okay, wait, it's not working. See, this is why you shouldn't try things. Oh, wait, it's working. Okay, we got it. Okay. And yeah, I wanted to at least ground myself in where I came from as I entered into Marist, because I came in as a comms and a comms major and a music minor. And I share 2 childhood photos of me, mostly to show that you too can wear socks with sandals and still make it through life okay. But also because, you know, I grew up in the Bronx, but in a really strong Irish Catholic community, actually, but also a deeply immigrant community. And there were so many intersections there of rights and justice and philosophies of life that really, you know, grounded who I was as a person. And I think growing up, going through both grammar school and into high school in Catholic school with a really, really strong sense of service, but also of social justice, I knew going into, you know, where did I want to go in life, there was very much this grounding of service and an orientation towards really a working class upbringing, because my neighborhood, as said, was majority working class. I started waitressing from the age of 14 and didn't stop until I was about 26. And I don't like to divorce those parts of me from who I am today, because they were really important to my thinking and why I started down the path of different questions that got me to where I am today and the work that I'm doing with We Do. And so I really want to hone in on the fact that this key question I had from kind of my earlier upbringing was, how can I help others? And that really framed what I wanted to work in when I went into college. The other thing, as Jam pointed out before, though, was that I was a musician and in a lot of theater, and I really wanted to be an actress. So for the most part, I had decided that my aspirations were somehow to find work at this intersection of being an actress and serving others and helping others. And so one of these questions that's coming up a lot in my mind was, how can I be an actress concerned with politics, essentially? And all throughout kind of high school, what I decided was, okay, if I can either be on TV or I can write TV. Oh, wow, I could be, I really loved, like any good poli-sci nerd back in the early 2000s, I loved The West Wing. Oh, maybe I could be a press secretary, or I could find a way to be an anchor on a news network, a communications network. And it's partly why I saw and created or came into Marist with a framing around being a comms major and working in radio, TV, film, because that was going to be my entry point to finding this perfect intersection of politics and acting. And I remember having, in my first poli-sci courses that I took, because I knew I was interested in poli-sci. One of my first ones was with Dr. Eckert. And Lynn, we were chatting, and she was asking me all these things about what I was passionate about. And she knew I loved the classes that I was taking with her, that I couldn't wait to get into that space to talk about the Constitution, which I think maybe I'm among friends in this conversation, but is possibly not the norm beyond that. And I remember Lynn asking me, how do you plan to communicate policies if you don't study politics? And it was just one of those, like, cut to the core, what are you trying to do here? That made me really question the classes I was taking and the direction that I was taking. And I think that week I changed my major to be a poli-sci major. I still took amazing communications courses at Marist, public speaking, and it was always really important to understand how people engage and communicate with each other. And I remained a music minor, so I didn't want to lose my theater and music, which I did all throughout my time at Marist. But it was a pivotal moment in terms of helping me really hone in on the desire to be in service was the strongest desire and passion that I actually had. And so, this question, then I titled this, Am I a Feminist? There's a lot of questions here, but once I decided, okay, I'm gonna go down this track of political science, I really started thinking about these questions of, what is my political philosophy? How can I serve others at the front lines of multiple forms of crisis? And am I a feminist? And what does that mean? And it's really interesting because, as you'll see later on in the work that I do now, so much of it is underpinned through the study and understanding of feminist approaches to both, international policy and global development. And at the time, I think I was very much still in an individualist thinking of how does the world and its impacts impact on me personally and my experiences. And so if I hadn't, for example, ever been told, well, because you're a woman, you can't do this, then discrimination based on sex just didn't exist. And it was interesting because it took a lot of the classes that I took at Marist to help me break through that conversation, to understand that there are dynamics at play, not just when it comes to gender, but of course when it comes to race, class, and other intersections, that you cannot make a political philosophy based on your own individual experience, that it has to be really understood within a broader system. And that was really important for me, and I think important as you're maybe all struggling with each other and in these spaces to kind of take on the different norms that are being thrown at you, or the different philosophies that are being thrown at you, and kind of wade between where they are and how they're informing your own ideas. And for me, that was one of those critical pieces of thinking through, both from, the conversations and the dialogues we had in classes like Dr. Jam's, also through, I had a class on public practice with Dr. Marr, where we really focused in on across a dialogue with different students that were working in different capacities in different majors. And we took on a public praxis crisis. And in that case, we were really trying to get the US to take greater action regarding the genocide in Darfur at the time. And that was a hugely important moment of thinking through how we work together to build a public policy campaign as students, for example. I took an amazing course with Dr. Sean Shea in my senior year, which was called The Political Economy of Southeast Asia. And that was, again, this really broadening out my understanding of global justice and where the US sits in the world in terms of international relations, but also how, political economies and histories that maybe we hadn't been part of our dominant narrative in what we learned in high school, and the history that we learned in high school were critical to informing our worldviews. Bill Olner, who's an MP, I list there, was actually a member of parliament that I worked for when in my junior year, I was part of the Hansard program and I studied in London. I think at the time it felt like my friends and I in poli-sci had two choices of going to the Hill or going to London. And I decided that I really wanted to broaden out the international scope of my understanding of politics. And it was a really fascinating time. I spent a lot of my coursework in that year abroad studying European politics, which has been really interesting from the framing of watching Brexit happen, for example, because I had a really strong understanding of what brought the EU together and what the framing of that was. And then I had the opportunity to work for this member of parliament who is a working class bulldog from Nuneaton, a former mine worker. And I got to spend my 21st birthday with the trade unions for safe nuclear energy, talking about what a just transition to a renewable energy economy might look like. And it gave me this really first opportunity to do a practical study and understanding of the UK energy system and what a transition away from nuclear and oil and gas might look like, which I couldn't know at the time would inform so much of what the work that I do today. But again, it was the fact that in my experiences at Marist, I was introduced to so many different intersectional elements of what do we mean by international policy. So to be able to dive deep into the political economies of different regions, to be able to dive deep into understanding renewable energy systems and how environmental politics play into international development, and really being questioned and challenged with what does inequality and injustice mean and look like, and how do our policies actually cause and or ameliorate the inequalities that exist around the world. And I remained a music and theater nerd the entire time, which I think is also really critically important to being and bringing your whole self into these spaces. So where I left Marist and kind of, again, in this kind of path to where I am today was really thinking less about how do I help others and more about how can I work to dismantle inequalities through a global development lens. So I think through each of these pieces, what was driving me and my passions became more clear, more crystallized, much more centered around justice as opposed to my individual desire to serve, and much more framed in a broader understanding of how systems work, essentially. And so I had the privilege to go back to, I should say that when I studied abroad with Hansard, my classes were at the London School of Economics. And so that inspired me to go back and get my graduate degree at the London School of Economics. And here I was able to focus on, I got a master's in gender development and globalization. So I was always someone who wanted to exist at the intersection of issues. That was sort of something I left as a key takeaway from my studies at Marist. And so finding a program that wasn't either fully focused on gender or fully focused on global development, or fully focused on politics, I really wanted to find an interdisciplinary study that would help me tackle all of these different issues. And you'll see that that's been a running theme throughout my life, actually. And so I could spend a really long time talking about how my year at LSE changed my entire life and worldview, but instead I'll just point to 4 key takeaways of how it kind of shook my world. It helped me really understand gender as a social construct, as a lens to be examining the world, just as race and class and other intersections are. I think that it was really important for me to interrogate from that question again of coming from a place of a very individualistic understanding of gender equality that was situated in my own personal experience of where I felt like I had opportunities and didn't, to one that understood the way that our society as a whole is gendered, that it is not necessarily something natural or innate, but it is something that defines our labor. It's something that defines our access to rights, and to really be able to interrogate the ways that that appeared in my own life, but also the ways that it shows up in our societies on a whole. That means that the things that we value and we invest in are not typically centered around care. And they're not typically centered around reproduction versus production. And there's a lot that can be said about that for the later work that I do now in trying to understand what a feminist framework is, for example, foreign policy, or for example, in a response to the COVID crisis. I also really, I think, grew in my understanding of how power is produced. I think that it's really challenging when you're first discussing human rights frameworks and international policy and law. They're often shown to you, or you read about them in these sort of black and whites of here are the international laws that exist. And it really takes kind of being in practice and being in those policy spaces to see just how much power is reproduced and systems of oppression are reproduced. And it defines the way that international policy and law are framed and developed and implemented, essentially. And this broad framing of global justice that I really learned and took away from my time at LSE was, again, one that's really grounded how I situate myself both as an organizer and a movement leader in the United States, seeing the role that we have to the broader global community, where particularly when it comes to issues like climate change, there we have both a moral and a historical responsibility to take action in a different way, beyond probably the scope that normative international relations and foreign policy would understand, because it has to do with this idea of global justice, of those at the front lines and those countries in particular that have kind of suffered the first and worst because of different policies that we have as a country, that we need to have a new norm of how we deliberate on foreign policy, which is not so much couched in creating good for the nation state, but creating good for the planet and what that means and what that looks like. And the last picture there is just, I want to say this is also where I became, in this time when I was at grad school, it's probably where I became much more deeply connected to movements. This was a Pride March, but I was actually there with the UK Youth Climate Coalition at the time. So again, trying to work at these intersections of using moments and movements to actually bring issue-oriented focus into those spaces. So all of that led me to that's sort of these different moments and different questions that I've had to ask myself, to the point where I got to after my grad school studies. I had a job for a few years in London, working at it was called LEAD. It was Leadership for Environment and Development, again, because I can't work at an organization that isn't tackling at least one or two major issues at once. And, I think my question that frames sort of the next decade of my life was, how can I break silos to tackle structural root causes and systems of oppression? And I thought through this a lot in terms of how do you move from a desire to help people into a framing of wanting to actually tackle social inequality and systems of oppression. And I think that I've come really full circle from what I would say is a very individualistic and somewhat martyr approach to helping, into one that really sees my own liberation deeply tied to the liberation of others and the freedom of others. And so it's less about how can I, in a one-directional way, help people, but how do I situate myself in the understanding that unless all people are free, no one is free, in a very crude assessment of that. And I have right above me here on my wall, and it's also here for you, one of my favorite quotes from Toni Morrison, which she says, I tell my students, when you get these jobs that you've been so brilliantly trained for, just remember that your real job is that if you are free, you need to free somebody else. If you have some power, then your job is to empower somebody else. It's not just a grab bag candy game. And so I take that with me in the work that I do at my organization and in life and in movements, that it's really about holding myself and ourselves accountable to making sure we do the work to really see both how oppressions reproduce themselves and to continually doing the work to make sure we're leaving no one behind, which is a phrase that you'll hear, for example, through the Sustainable Development Goals that the UN has created. This pathway and this broad intersectional approach to the major global development challenges, all of which are trying to, at the end, make sure we're leaving no one behind. Whether they're successful or not has a lot to do with how power is produced and how and where international law and policy is effective and isn't effective. So a little bit about We Do, I'm just checking on my time. We Do, the Women's Environment and Development Organization. I have been with We Do for a decade now. When I was studying and working in London, and I had actually, I don't think I said, but the dissertation that I did during the program at LSE, I focused on the links between gender equality and climate change, partly inspired by the work I had done with the member of parliament that I worked with, and also grounded, of course, in, okay, let's take two major issues and put them together, because that's what I like to do. And I knew that I wanted to find a place where I could continue to work at these intersections. And I remember the organization I was working with at the time, LEAD, one of our board members, Thais Corral, I realized had founded an organization called the Women's Environment and Development Organization, and it was based in New York. And so I decided sometime end of December 2010 that I was going to quit my job in London, move back to New York, and do whatever I could to work at We Do. And what that meant was, even though I had a master's degree in 2 years of work, that I interned for We Do. And I interned and I waitressed for about a year, because it was a really, really small organization and they didn't have a huge amount of turnover. But I felt really passionate that this was the organization that I needed to work at. And so I made some sacrifices in order to do so, but I think it was important for me to be in a place that I knew I could really grow and use the skills and knowledge that I had. So We Do is a US-based global advocacy organization. We were established actually while we were established in the 90s around the first Earth Summit. We grew out of, our original name was called Women USA, and we were an org that was founded in the 80s by US Congresswoman Bella Abzug and Gloria Steinem, Shirley Chisholm, a whole group of women's rights and gender equality leaders in the United States who were particularly interested in how US foreign policy impacted women and girls around the world. And so when in the 90s, the world started to really come together around broad environmental issues, around climate change, around biodiversity and desertification, in what was called the first Earth Summit in 1992, Women USA, alongside amazing activists such as Wangari Maathai, Vandana Shiva, Thais Corral. If you don't know them, I would advocate you look them up. Dr. Wangari Maathai is a Nobel Peace Prize winner who started the Greenbelt movement in Kenya, for example, planting millions of trees across Kenya. It's really interesting because there's a picture here of Dr. Wangari Maathai with Rigoberta Menchú, who's another Nobel Peace Prize winner, also from Guatemala, an amazing indigenous woman. And this is the two of them speaking on a panel at the Earth Summit in 1992. And so in that moment, women activists came together to say, you know, recognize that countries from around the world had come together to form in this Earth Summit to create massive conventions that would speak to climate, to biodiversity, to desertification. And if you can imagine, women were very barely present as negotiators and leaders in that space, and women's rights issues were not part of the policy agenda at all. And so the founding of WeDo was really grounded in how do we do two things? How do we make sure that women's presence, women in all their diversity, indigenous women, grassroots women, that they're present in these spaces of policy dialogue? And how do we make sure that their issues and our issues of that we are seeing at the forefront of managing natural resources, of water collection, of our communities and families, how do we make sure that those issues are actually going to be centered in the policies that come out of these international spaces? And so that was the founding of WeDo. And since that first Earth Summit in '92, in every single international global convention that has ever come about, you'll find that there is a women's caucus of some sort. WeDo is often co-leading that women's caucus and often doing the same work again to bring the perspectives and feminist understandings into the policy space, as well as to deal with the inequalities that still are rampant and exist in terms of representation. So actually working to make sure that women are present in these spaces as well. And so just to summarize a bit our work, and then I'm gonna go into a few of these key pieces. We deliver training and capacity building for women leaders on environment and climate change issues. We support grassroots women leaders at the front lines of climate impacts to speak truth to power in global policy spaces. We've had the honor of supporting some really incredible women human rights defenders and activists who are perhaps at the front lines of fighting against pipelines in their communities, activists who are working to create solutions such as solar energy cooperatives, seed saving, agroecological practices, and they're doing so on an amazing scale at a community level, and often those solutions are just left out of the conversations that are happening at global level. We showcase and amplify just alternatives to the current fossil fuel economy. So we are grounded in the fact that we have to transition away from a fossil fuel-based economy. And we know that the solutions to being able to do that in a just way, that there are solutions around the world that in particular, women, grassroots, and indigenous peoples are leading at a community level that need to be replicated and supported to really sustain and create a new low carbon society. And we do a lot of movement building. So we build power within diverse, fierce, transnational, feminist, and environmental justice movements. We create collectives around a lot of broad-based issues and come together to think both internationally as well as nationally here in the United States. How do we create change, essentially? A few zoom ins on some kind of how this work, what this means, because I know this is perhaps a lot of talk and a lot of words that don't give any meaning to what it means we actually do. So one example is the technical policy work we do. I, for example, for the last 10 years, have gone to every single climate change negotiation that has ever been held, including every intersessional. It's about 45 different meetings. And this is every meeting that has come together to both build and adopt the Paris Agreement, and every subsequent meeting after that. And part of the work that we do as technical policy advocates into that space is twofold. We run a program called the Women Delegates Fund, where we actually support and train women from the Global South to be delegates on their national coalitions and delegations, because when we first started doing this work in about I want to say 2010, the rate of participation of women on national climate change delegations was around 9% as heads of delegations, and they were 15% of overall national delegates. And now today you have around 30% of women as national delegates, but still only around 20% of women as heads of delegations. And so we analyze and try to understand the social inequalities and the barriers to having equitable and equal representation. And part of what we do is that we track every single meeting how the gender balance of every delegation in every country. And we've been doing that since 2008. And we wanted to make sure that information was open source. And so we created a mobile app where you can get and access that information. We also have tracked every single reference to women and gender and social justice that has been included in the climate change negotiations. We've also put forward a lot of that language. So we've done the work of advocating to governments to help craft language to actually be reflected in things like the Paris Agreement, which is one of the first agreements to include the assurance that all climate action should uphold human rights as well as gender equality and the empowerment of women. And if I could tell you the amount of work that goes into getting one sentence in a policy document, it's years of work and it's major campaigns. And it's kind of, yeah, it's really challenging to both understand that and see why it is so difficult to have language around human rights and gender equality in a policy document, for example. And so you can go on this gender climate tracker. You can find the references across the decisions of the UNFCCC. You can look at countries' nationally determined contributions or national climate plans and see how they have integrated gender equality and women's rights into the work that they're doing. You can also become a gender climate tracker if you're interested and help us to upload and create resources per country, for example. We also, because we do sit at the center of multiple different collectives that feed into these different global policy processes, when the pandemic really became present in all of our minds, we really turned towards each other as global collectives, and we started building together with no resources and no mandate to do so, but knowing that we needed to create a shared memory and a direction of what feminist response to COVID would look like, knowing that this was a moment that was showcasing things that were deemed impossible to be possible, whether that be the potential for providing universal basic income, for example, the potential for real investment in healthcare and education. Now, whether or not that has happened is something, again, that we are tracking. But we found this to be a moment where a lot of the feminist principles around investment in a care economy became really at the forefront of other people's minds as well. And so we developed a set of principles around what feminist responses look like that included things like universal access to healthcare, universal access to vaccines when they become available, which is something our advocates are fighting really hard for in the United Nations, for example, making sure that we take climate and sustainability into account, that when we're bailing out people and not pollution and polluters, for example, is a big campaign that we're a part of, and trying to monitor which industries are recovering and which are not from this crisis. And we're also looking at policy responses that are being done in the name of global health or national health that have potentially regressive tendencies if they are not fully ameliorated once we are in a more recovery period. And so you can find the principles on this website. And you can also, again, there's submission forms here. We're actually having a volunteer party this week, and I'll send y'all the link to that if you're interested. Because again, as said, this is a site that we are continually updating and collecting together to be able to mark where we see progress and where we are seeing potentially regressive policies put in place. The next kind of, I would say these are some just the highlight pieces of work that we're working on right now. In the last couple of years, you might know that several countries, Sweden, Canada, Mexico, France, have launched feminist foreign policies. They've put together frameworks for delivering on feminist foreign policy, some of which is unclear in terms of what the principles of their feminist foreign policies would look like. Mexico, for example, has a small framework that includes that feminist foreign policy is intersectional, that it links specifically to trade, to climate change, and to international diplomacy. But one of the efforts that we were part of was to gather with global women's rights and feminist activists to define a set of principles of what actually is what actually defines a feminist foreign policy. What are the pathways and entry points for a country considering this? And then we've actually been working in a broad coalition to try to define feminist foreign policy in the United States. And I think, this might be a concept that's hard to understand in terms of what do we mean by feminist foreign policy. But essentially, it's really, in our minds, it's trying to deal with what would be the inadequate and antiquated nature of foreign policy in of itself, to be first and foremost a protection of the nation state, as opposed to an understanding of foreign policy that has to serve a global good, one that is grounded in linking women's rights and gender equality to broad structural issues that they're often delinked from. And so that can include trade, militarism, environment, for example, and making sure that that becomes wholly part of the conversation. And this is not some just pie in the sky principles based. There was actually 23 members of Congress that proposed a resolution on this just a week ago. Jackie Spear led this and defined in the resolution that women's rights are human rights, and foreign policy in the United States should be representative, inclusive, responsive, and accountable to stakeholders, should take an intersectional approach, utilizing a power-based analysis that reveals, acknowledges, and seeks to correct for inequalities, and that feminist foreign policy includes a focus on key thematic priorities of bodily autonomy, peace, environmental integrity, and justice, which are often left behind in foreign policy development and discourse. So this has been a resolution put forward in Congress, and there's also been a transition document, a 100-day plan that's been presented to both potential next administrations on how to actually take this forward and implement it. And then the last thing I wanted to point to in this piece is, if I can get back to, yes, is another collective that we're working in, which is around the development of a feminist Green New Deal. So in 2019, when this idea of a Green New Deal really started to become very prevalent in the mind and the language and dialogue of the nation of the United States, many of the same activists that have been working again at this intersection felt that it was critical that we use the opportunity to bring a feminist lens to any Green New Deal discussions, movement building, and policy making. Part of the framing, and if you go to that website here, you'll see some of the key principles that we created around what a feminist Green New Deal would look like. That it, first of all, required intersectional gender analysis across all actions. We really fundamentally wanted to recognize that there's actually no such thing as domestic climate policy, and that's global justice framing is a huge framing of our principles in that, because often you'll see national policies discussed only in the context of jobs and jobs that'll be created and economic opportunities in our country, but actually it needs to be framed in the global injustice that's being felt by the lack of action in the United States due to the impacts of climate change. That it needs to confront institutional patriarchy and racism. So we wanted to make sure any climate and Green New Deal policies that went forward weren't siloed from and had to be centered in patriarchy and racism as systems that, again, further oppressions, and that it needed to center and heed frontline leadership, including that of Indigenous peoples. And one thing I recognize that we haven't had too much time or haven't been able to go into in too much detail is just some of the basic questions that perhaps you're contemplating, or maybe they're not so clear of what do gender and climate change have to do to with each other. What do women's rights and environment have to do together? I have 2 documents here that I'm going to throw in the chat that go into more detail, because I didn't want to spend all my time just talking through examples of what this looks like with you. One is a piece that looks globally at the literature on what the links between gender equality and climate change are across different countries when we think about adaptation, livelihoods, jobs, transport, etc. A second one is a recent one that we just did in 2020, which looks particularly at the US and why and where there are intersections of gender and climate change. I can give you some examples. So in the US, men represent approximately 72% of workers in energy and fuel production, including workers in sectors at risk from shifts to a low carbon society, as well as those in sectors that will benefit. While at the same time, we see women, particularly women of color, making up the vast percentage of frontline workers in care industries, such as healthcare and education. And care jobs, we know that care jobs are green jobs in terms of the amount of output that they produce and the impact that they have on society, which is mostly in the creation of knowledge, production, and care. But they don't receive the pay or even protective equipment that indicate that we as a society value and indeed rely on their work. So gender, class, and race are determinants across numerous economic and health impacts of environmental degradation, increased disasters, pollution from extractive industries that drive climate change. We see these intersections in the timeline after disasters. For example, there were many studies of the impacts of Hurricane Katrina, both who was most impacted by it, but what the long-term impacts were. We saw job losses were greater for women because they were not in the construction and infrastructure industries that actually saw job increases from post-disaster. We also really alarmingly saw that rates of violence in certain communities against women were 3 times higher post-Katrina than prior to. So again, seeing where all of these issues intersect is really important. And globally, we have a lot of research that shows that more equitable representation leads to more environmentally friendly policies, and that the investment in women and girls' education, as well as access to healthcare, enhances a country's resilience to climate change. So, we try to make sure in our work and our advocacy that we have a really strong evidence base for the policies and the initiatives that we're putting forward and the frameworks that we're putting forward. And maybe just to, in the last 3 minutes, to close with some, what does that my day actually look like, or what does the day in the life of a global advocate look like? We are on Zoom calls all the time now, as I'm sure all of you are as well, in multiple different collectives. So perhaps that's US-based collectives with other environmental organizations such as 350 or the Sunrise Movement, or the Gulf Coast Center for Law and Policy, some of you might know. And some of those conversations are centered around how do we ensure a just recovery to the pandemic in the United States, one which doesn't exacerbate climate injustice and our challenges and our climate challenges. We are part of collectives, as shown, where we're trying to think about, on Monday, for example, the Secretary General is hosting a town hall to talk about women's rights. So how do we bring these broader structural issues into that town hall? And we'll strategize together with women really from around the world and grassroots leaders and activists to figure out how do we bring these key messages and who is going to be able to have voice in those spaces. We've also, for example, in the last week, been asked to participate in Canada's consultations on their new climate finance pledge. And the Minister of the Interior there specifically wanted to know how their next climate finance pledge could be more gender responsive and more feminist. And so we came up with a briefing for them, and we briefed the minister on steps that they could take to make their policies more gender responsive. And we do, as said, a lot of strategic advocacy, whether that's the creation of policy analysis, transition documents, as I mentioned before, or just strategic campaigns and op-eds to really advocate and kind of change minds or shift minds towards the intersections that we work at, so that there's more information and understanding available. And just like these documents that I've shared here with you, we also do a lot in terms of research and knowledge production, trying to see where the gaps are in our knowledge and invest in that, so that we can really kind of reach our ultimate goal in terms of our policy advocacy. So I think that was a lot. That was just a 45 minutes. So I hope that was somewhat helpful. It's really hard to know which of these different aspects to hone in on. And I'm sorry, and I apologize if I left you with more questions than answered any, because I talked about a lot of really broad-based frameworks that we're working on, but I'm really eager to hear from you and debunk or explain anything that I maybe didn't get a chance to go into.
Okay, so you guys can ask some questions, but I'm going to ask sort of that elephant in the room question, Bridget.
Great. Yes.
And that is, you know, where do men fit in? Where do males fit in a feminist philosophy of?
Yeah. Well, for us, patriarchy has no gender. So I should say that that's a really important meta-narrative for us. And I think it's really important that while we do a lot of work, because we live in a society that is gendered, and there's still, as shown by the numbers and the percentages and just the lack of women in all their diversity in representation and leadership, we do have projects where we are focused on lifting the voices of women and girls, for example, and understanding the evidence base where discrimination is happening. But we work really hard in the feminist collectives that we're part of to make sure that that work is deeply intersectional. So when we talk about women and girls, we are saying women in all their diversity. We are talking about the LGBTQI community. We're talking about Black and Indigenous women, and we're being very specific about that. And that we're understanding that maybe that might be part of our analysis, but when we're talking about a feminist response, we're not talking about a women's response. We're talking about an intersectional analysis, a structural analysis of the causes of inequality, one that understands a society that invests less in care and caremaking, and that actually being part of the problem. And if, for example, we really thought through we often look at our, we got told that there's not enough money for climate change. So the estimates of how we combat the climate challenge are that we need trillions each year to invest in both technologies and adaptation to be able to combat the challenges. And yet the Green Climate Fund has $10 billion that has been pledged to it over the last 5 years, and another 10 billion has gone in. We're getting nowhere near the 100 billion that countries have committed to, let alone towards the trillions that we need. And yet at the same time, I think we had something like 373 billion in fossil fuel subsidies last year, and something like, and I have this stat somewhere else, so I'm not gonna say it incorrectly on here, but in the hundreds of trillions in global military spend, where the intersections of which that creates a cyclical both environmental harm as well as harm for gender equality are deeply clear. So that's a feminist analysis. It's one of where are we divesting? How can we divest from harm to invest in care? And there is no gender to those who can have that analysis, and there is also no gender to those who can perform patriarchy, if that makes sense. And then.
Hi, thank you for being here today. I had a quick question regarding COVID and like gender equality, just in general. You mentioned earlier how care workers are predominantly women of color or just women in general. And I could only imagine that those are the workers that are receiving like the brunt of like the harm from COVID. Are you aware of any like policy or is your organization making any efforts to look into this or address this, or is this a non-issue that isn't salient enough to be brought to your guys' agenda?
No, it's absolutely a key part. I'm just putting in the chat something called the Thrive Agenda, which is an agenda that we have been working on with allies across the United States. It's a broad-based agenda that's framed around a new vision to revive our economy while addressing climate change, racial injustice, public health, and economic inequity. We've worked on this economic recovery package in the Thrive Agenda as the Feminist Green New Deal Coalition to try to center care more explicitly in this and to make sure, and you'll often find even with our partners that we are the ones bringing the voice of how do you center care and how do you center this approach and how do you make sure you have a gender analysis? Because, for example, just I think not only in terms of the front lines of impacts and who's actually being protected, getting access to protective equipment. This is something that as part of the Feminist Collective to COVID, we're doing a really large scale analysis through our partners of what the impacts people have faced around the world are, women in particular, and what policies or kind of responses have been put in place that helped them, that supported their recovery, and which kind of countries are not doing enough to support that recovery. So it's certainly 100% on our agenda. Some of it is being dealt with through this Thrive agenda. We're working with partners to really push through with policymakers at a US level. We're also working with this discussion, we're bringing this into the discussion that's happening at global level. And there's so many facets to it. I mean, I just saw the other day that I think it's 875,000 women exited the workforce last month or in 1 month during the COVID crisis. You're seeing more and more analysis of how the impacts to the crisis are gendered, both in terms of the impacts from it and who's really at the front lines of the crisis. So in short, yes, it's on our agenda. We're working in collaboration and collectives to make sure it's front and center to policy initiatives to respond to the crisis.
Thank you. Thank you so much. That was a really, really good answer. So you guys are basically just focusing on gauging the impact that this is having overall for now, because it's hard to take any action if you don't really know like the full scope of what the problem is, I'm assuming.
Yeah, I think I would say that we have a lot of this are policy initiatives that that we have as activists been fighting for decades in terms of access to health, education, and care, which very much center the experiences of frontline workers and women in particular. I was looking the other day where I saw that Bella Abzug and Shirley Chisholm had put forward a resolution to provide 24-hour care facilities and kind of to nationalize care facilities. And, you know, this is a resolution from 30 years ago, but it didn't get through the House, and it wasn't enacted on. And so there are a lot of policy solutions centered around providing care that would be really, really important to have in this moment of crisis. If we had a deeper infrastructure for care work, for healthcare, for education, beyond, you know, the ways in which schools, for example, have individually been figuring out how to deal with these with very few resources and lack of investment to begin with. So part of it, yes, is studying the impacts. Part of it is already knowing that a society without social protections is one that cannot be resilient to either a pandemic or to climate change. And so we are looking at what the impacts of this crisis are, but we also already know the kinds of policies that could be put in place that would create a more resilient society, because we've been studying that for decades. And when I say we, I mean like activists and feminists globally, thinking about how do you create a world that's more resilient to shocks, essentially.
Thank you. That was great. I'll be sure to check out the link that you sent in the description, because this seems like a really important issue.
Absolutely. And all of these have lots of ways for you to get involved. Almost all the links that I've shared with you so far have volunteer opportunities, and We Do as an organization, which the website was put into the chat window, wedo.org. We always are looking for ways to engage either through internships or volunteer opportunities. As you can see, we have a lot of different projects going at different times, so would really welcome anyone interested to get in touch, essentially.
So Bridget, you keep on mentioning care. Could you sort of expand your definition of what you actually mean by care? Because it is so, you need to unpack it a little because
Yeah.
it is such a complicated term.
It is. I mean, and I think at a kind of a very basic level, we're talking about the aspects of the economy that are centered around healthcare, disability, elder care, disabled care, care work for children, whether that is through education or care work, which is actually just taking care of children in, from infancy to through to adulthood, essentially, and understanding that that encompasses a whole range of work. And, we see when we talk about infrastructure, we always leave care work out of that conversation. And so it's as if we think we exist in a society where the only thing we need to be able to work and to thrive are roads and bridges and buildings, essentially. And we forget about the people in them and the fact that most of us live in society in connection with other people. And we need sustenance through ability to take care of our health and ability to educate ourselves. And in order to do that, we need to see care work as a critical part of our infrastructure. And so just like every building needs an access road to get to it, people need care support and time either to be able to deliver caregiving, or they need support to be able to do it in order to participate in society. And this is all just becoming really, really prevalent in the pandemic, because you're seeing people for the first time, being expected to be everything, the caregiving responsibilities that have been on the shoulders of people for a long time without investment or support are even further amplified. And it is, it's one of the infrastructures that we don't have a lot of support for, in terms of how do we invest in these spaces and services so that they are provided, so that people can make choices and thrive in sort of in different aspects in life. And so I feel like for me, when I talk about care, it's really about how do we shift our society's understanding of what a vital infrastructure to help society thrive looks like. One that is founded first and foremost on providing an infrastructure for care for each other, for our communities, for our elder care, for our children. And there's a whole set of policies that are required. The first and foremost of which is parental leave, but obviously and family leave. We're not limiting it to that. That's just the kicking the door open, that you should be able to take time to take care of family. And that's kind of the entry point for thinking about care policies. But we are, talking about a climate care corps. Like we have we have a teachers corps and we have an Army corps. Like, why don't we have a climate care corps that's all about providing care services, that's about community agriculture and agroecology, that's about supporting communities in the transition to new energy systems? What could this really look like? And it, again, is just looking at where we invest our resources and where we don't. And, we as a society have severely, and I say in the United States, we have severely underfunded social services. We do not invest in social protection in the way that we invest in technology and militarism, just to be very frank, and even financial services. And so, it's a really critical part of the conversation to question where our resources are going. I don't know if I have a lot of other resources I can share with you that kind of make the case for what do we mean by a caring economy, and how is that key to a climate transition as well. But you know, for us, it's just this basic framework of we're in a cycle of investment in the wrong thing. So how do we divest from harm, the things that are harming us, which in our analysis is fossil fuel infrastructure, militarism, and the carceral state, and how do we invest in care?
Excellent answer, because a lot of times we don't invest in things that we don't pay for, the unpaid labor or the underpaid labor.
Yeah, exactly.
So we have a question in the chat from Jake Shoemaker, which is not necessarily related to gender equality. However, he's curious. Do you believe that nuclear energy is an effective, reliable, and safe form of clean energy to help replace fossil fuel? So when you were talking, and I think this comes from when you were talking about alternative
Yes.
sources.
No, I do not. And
that's counter to most of our board of trustees.
Well, and I understand that there are many who, you know, see that this has to be part of the package. It's actually it was the focus of the work I did when I worked for MP Bill Olner, because I was with the trade unions for safe nuclear energy, and the UK was thinking about its future energy mix. And essentially they wanted to invest in a third, which was a third coal, a third nuclear, and a third renewable. And so I then did this kind of full-scale analysis, and it was my first entry point into whether nuclear energy was a viable alternative. And there are two pieces to it. One is that, let alone take aside why I don't think nuclear is a safe and viable alternative, even if it was, in terms of the transition that we need and the full-scale investment to be able to shift towards other renewable energy sources, there is a real need that we do not take energy mix approaches, because we have that technology has to advance in terms of being able to solve what some of the greatest challenges of renewable energy is so far, which is to do with peak load technology as well as storage. So how do you store and maintain different renewable energy sources? There's a lot of great work happening around that, but it is going to take the full-scale investment of governments and private sector to really shift away from. And so if we are investing in different forms at the same time, including nuclear, it really takes away from that ability to transition. This was an argument made by Amory Lovins, and it's one that I kind of focused in on a lot in terms of whether this was market compatible to be able to do the transition. I also think that nuclear energy just doesn't make sense economically, financially. The market returns on nuclear, the cost that it takes to, you know, have a nuclear plant, the time lag that it is for its production, making it safe, the amount of effort put into dealing with nuclear waste means that economically it's not viable. And then fundamentally is that we have not solved the problem for dealing with nuclear waste. It still poses, you know, like I said, I've been hanging out with safe trade, you know, nuclear energy people for a long time. And I do not see that the safety standards are to the extent that they would ever need to be, that they would ever be able to be to truly make the production of nuclear energy safe for people and planet. And this is actually a really strong historical feminist issue. So we have a lot of colleagues from both Japan as well as from Eastern Europe whose entire histories have been defined by dealing with the impacts of nuclear waste, who are fundamentally and fully adamant that our solutions do not include nuclear as an option.
And partly, when we look at nuclear waste, it becomes an environmental justice issue.
Yeah, absolutely.
Because even here in the United States, where do we put our nuclear waste?
Absolutely. And it's consistent. I mean, if you look at, you know, Cancer Alley in the United States, and who are suffering from the worst impacts of the toxic outputs from both our fossil fuel infrastructure and our garbage incinerators, it's wholly an environmental justice issue. It's always low-income communities. It's always those with the least access to repudiation and resources if things go wrong. So absolutely, it's partly why we do that broad-based analysis is to understand that at the end of this, all of these, if you cut corners, that there are certain people who are not going to be losers from that. So certain people will, with certain access to rights, resources, and status, won't feel the impacts of a short-term solution to solving this crisis, but there will be losers, and it will be those who are at the front lines in these communities who are facing the impacts.
And we should also recognize that Poughkeepsie is within that 50-mile zone if anything should happen at Indian Point.
Yep.
Right. So in my opinion, and remember that I did my graduate work at RPI, nuclear energy is, while it might be efficient to produce energy, its downside is way out of balance.
Mm-hmm.
In my opinion. So Jake, did that help you?
Yes, thank you. Thank you for the answer. It was very insightful and very well thought out. Thank you.
Okay, great. Are there other questions out there? Well, if not, I know that some of you have other courses that you have to go off to because they're meeting now. So can we thank Bridget?
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
all.
Thank you very much.
Great.
Thank you. Thank you.
So great. So this is going to be recorded there, Bridget, and I'll send you it is recorded. I'll send you the link when it gets, I don't know how it gets finalized. It's above my pay grade.
Okay.
But I know that I got a whole bunch of messages from my students who said that they were in other classes that they had to meet because of this past week. So they are looking forward to the link.
Awesome.
So great. Well, thank you. And Dr. Eckert also, chimed in too.
Yeah,
So
I did. You can tell I quoted her on my.
Yeah, I did. I texted her. She goes, "Oh," she said, "so nice of her to do that." And I actually also said that we should use part of your clip when you were talking about your education at Marist and as sort of a promo for our poli-sci.
Yeah,
program.
I'm your biggest fan. So.
Yeah. Well, thank you. Thank you for doing that.
Well, thank you for the opportunity. It was interesting to use this presentation for the first time. It was a little bit distracting actually for my conversation thoughts. So I hope I wasn't too all over the place, but I appreciate the time to practice with this new technology.
Good. And so what I'm going to do is I'll print up some of the links that you gave.
Yeah,
and,
great.
So I'll attach that somehow because I'm not sure if the chat will normally just come in.
Yeah.
To it. So cool. Well, thank you very much for your time this afternoon. Now go out and enjoy yourself.
I will do. Thanks so much.
Okay. Ciao. Bye. Bye all.